From I Am Interchange, this is the Hatch podcast series.
It seems now more than ever that we have found ourselves on the cusp of monumental worldwide change. Whether we consider the environment, politics, infrastructure, health, economics, or inequities across a broad swath of social constructs, the consensus is clear and urgent. All is not as it should be. The United Nations, a consortium of 193 member states from around the globe, agrees. In 2015, the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These goals call for urgent action in global partnership to secure peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future.
In alignment with the SDGs, Hatch, a curated network of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs working together to accelerate positive global change, has partnered with I Am Interchange to fuse adventure journalism with experiential design labs to develop innovative solutions to complex global challenges. I'm Tate Chamberlain, and in this episode, I host Tony Cho, CEO and founder of Future of Cities, and Metro One, an innovative real estate firm developing inclusive, equitable communities and sustainable cities in South Florida and beyond. Stan Stalnaker, social globalization expert and founder and chief strategy officer of Hub Culture, a collaborative exchange platform, and acclaimed economist, author, and Replenish Earth CEO Dr. Tia Kansara. Here they imagine the future of the planet, of its inhabitants, global economies, and diverse cities and environments through a regenerative lens. And that future is bright with hope. A whole lot of love for Future of Cities, Hub Culture, and Replenish Earth for co-producing this episode with us. We're in Egypt. Join us, won't you?
How's it going? Having us. It's fantastic. The weather's phenomenal, and we have a beautiful environment to have captivating conversations with inspiring leaders and indigenous leaders and climate activists and urban planners and policymakers from around the world. And, you know, I got a chance to go to the Blue Zone the other day, and it creates a lot of anxiety to be in those types of environments because...
Especially when you're trying to park.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the fact that there's, you know, let's be real here. I mean, we're at a climate conference and you can't get anywhere without a car. I mean, already that's, you know, as far as is a fundamental flaw of how the place is organized. I get the whole security needs for all these world leaders. And, you know, I've been to New York. We were in Glasgow last year when Stan and I first partnered to do a collaborative event together. And, you know, it just reaffirms why I like, you know, what's special about cities and the ecosystem of being able to walk around and, you know, all the businesses that are there and all the amenities that a city provides. It's like a living organism. And I think that that's essentially the inspiration of my work at the Future of Cities. And Future of Cities is a platform that I launched 2 years ago based on years of kind of struggling and suffering through urban revitalization and the negative impacts that happen from gentrification that's caused by unconscious placemaking, as we call it. And so I held this inquiry for a number of years of how can we reverse gentrification? How can we mitigate it and create equitable, inclusive, sustainable communities of the future, primarily focus on underserved communities? Because there's a lot of projects that are focused on the wealthy 1% who have the resources to invest in innovation and technology. But really, if we're going to move the needle, we need to focus on the 99%. We need to focus on the voiceless, the unheard, the unbanked, the uninterneted, all of the folks who are just the unsung, unspoken people out there. And I think that that's really when we're going to see climate solutions scale. And places like Africa, you know, that are the cities of the future, because that's where all the population growth is happening, primarily in the global south and Africa and Asia. But really, you know, we're open sourcing and co-designing this new sustainable framework called regenerative placemaking. And we had the incredible opportunity to partner with Stan from Hub Culture again. here in Sharm el-Sheikh, last year in Glasgow, and during Art Basel at our new Innovation and Climate Hub that's launching at the end of this month, November 30th. So stay tuned for that.
It's really interesting because this is one of many hubs we've done. The place we're at now has been taking quite a bit of work to realize. And we worked with Future of Cities last year in Glasgow. It was really great. And then we've really kept in touch. I think there's also this intersecting period from these kind of what we call internally heart attack moments where everything spikes and then you're super intense, but then it sort of levels back out. And Hub is present at a lot of these places, whether it's Davos at the World Economic Forum or UN Climate Week or Art Basel Miami. And then we have fixed places around the world as well. But what I find interesting about Sharm in particular and what's happening here is quite honestly like a real effort. Like there are some things here that are results of the fixed infrastructure. And what you just said at the beginning of your talk there is really crucial because we are at a climate conference driving around in cars if we're moving at all. And what's very interesting is watching the transformation of this city in the last 3 months. The New York Times has come out with some pretty critical coverage in the last couple of days about the infrastructure setup. There have been issues within the conference center about delegates not being able to get food or water, different things like that. But the fundamental fact remains that the Egyptian government has prioritized this conference in a way that I find extraordinary. And that's reflected in the transformation of the city. So most people have arrived and seen the city just in the last few days. I've been coming back and forth here since July. And in July, the city was under construction. They were putting in sidewalks. There wasn't a tree anywhere. And the transformation over the last even 3 weeks, because we were here 3 weeks ago, I can't believe it. Like, it's really incredible. And I don't think Sharm is getting quite enough credit for how much they put in. They built a walking promenade all the way through the city, and they've shaded it so that they can increase pedestrianism. They put in bike lanes that mirror the entire, kind of main thoroughfare of the city. But true, they've also put in major highways going up to the mountains. I think they're planning to grow this as part of a regional, massive metro movement that will happen over the next 10 years. But they are doing some things like solar-powered streetlights, things like that. And it's not everything, because what they probably need are completely different modes of looking at zero carbon mobility. But I think what's interesting to me is that Egypt has put, I think, a lot more effort into welcoming the world here and showing a version of modern Egypt than we've given them credit for. And quite frankly, there are some security concerns here that are very different than we had in Glasgow. And that has resulted in difficulties. The reason people aren't getting fed is the food security issues are very strong. They won't let anyone who isn't completely vetted by the government to be able to get near food because they're worried about terrorism. So there are some unique challenges here. And I think that despite the many human rights issues, the overall environmental footprint of the country, there are some really interesting progressive things happening with the Egyptians here that I think deserve some credit.
Thanks, Dan. We've got a guest who popped in. How's it going, Tia? What does regeneration mean to you?
I think maybe Tia can go first because she just regenerated in Mount Sinai last night with my wife. So that's why she arrived a little bit late. So I think that's one form of regeneration that I did not get to partake in, unfortunately.
About all this Mount Sinai stuff.
She did it.
The third person I've seen go up the mountain overnight.
She did it twice.
Well, this is her second day in a row of no sleep.
It's my second day, and it's my third time in 4 days.
I went with her the night before.
Regeneration. It's so loaded already. And maybe around 2001 or 2, we were getting a lot of language around sustaining the status quo. Sustainability kept coming to the fore. There was the conversations about the Brundtland reports. 1987, UN Sustainability for All was coming out. And I think really it's a bifurcation of a narrative that has been plagued with a tremendous amount of control. And I think the challenge is, how do you design a methodology that can keep on giving, like a gift that keeps on giving, that continues to support not only the person that is designing it, but it forever harvests. Like we had Stephen talk about yesterday in his farm, that you plant it once and you reap the harvest. That's what you ever do.
Yeah, the idea of perennial agriculture.
Love that.
I thought that was great too.
That.
Yeah.
I think there's this beauty in perennial everything, whether it is a thought or it's an effort. I think for me, regenerate means to create something that forever lives on without the effort necessary. It's almost like this passive growth.
I'm finding it really interesting because I feel like when you go to these moments, whether it's Davos or COP, there are often keywords, and the keywords get infected into, the conversation. And it was sustainability, and then it was inclusion for a while, like diversity. Inclusion and diversity. But all of a sudden, diversity was out, and you had to say inclusion. And what I'm seeing this week is suddenly regenerative is in. We did some stuff with the Imperial College Business School yesterday, and the whole thing was about building regenerative purpose. And so purpose has been another keyword that has been, I think, getting very embedded in the mission for corporations. But regenerative purpose was something like a remix that I hadn't seen before.
I think that's it, right?
What is a regenerative company?
You're like, we're all rapping on all of these words.
But, we hear these words, and then suddenly it's not good enough to be net zero, you have to be net positive. Mm-hmm. Now it's not good enough to be net positive, you have to be regenerative. Mm-hmm. So, okay, I guess I could buy that. But I think fundamentally, there's been a huge shift about regenerative agriculture being fringe, and now it seems like everyone understands that we're in big trouble if we don't get to at-scale regenerative agriculture.
Then there'll be something else.
Yeah, I think the main point of regeneration as a concept is that it goes beyond sustainability, right? Because sustainability is status quo, and we know full well that just isn't enough. And so for me, I think, the human body is a regenerative organism. It heals itself. It's incredibly resilient in and of itself. And, we haven't done enough to heal ourselves. And so I think it starts with, self-care and regeneration of each individual. It's that famous Rumi quote, yesterday I was clever and I wanted to change the world. And today I'm wise and I want to change myself, right? So I think regeneration starts with the individual and being right, within yourself. And then it's kind of creating systems and methodologies that are self-perpetuating, that are self-fulfilling, self-repairing, and I think the technologies all exist. And it isn't enough to be net zero because we know that we're not going to meet our climate goals. We're not going to meet 1.5 degrees Celsius, with the current regulatory frameworks and challenges and disagreements that we have between and among countries. We need to go beyond borders, for us to be able to solve these problems. So I think regeneration starts with the individual, but it's creating ecosystems, it's creating technologies, it's creating communities that are resilient. And I think that that's really something that's very important. And we're seeing just right now, there's a hurricane coming to Florida, directly where our retreat center is. It's a category 1. Hopefully it won't be that destructive, but the last one was the costliest hurricane just a month ago. And this is the third hurricane that's ever happened during a November time period. So people can argue about, is climate change human caused or not? I know, where I stand, but let's just look at regeneration and resilience,
right? Yeah. The evidence is irrefutable.
Yesterday, it was framed that the SDGs are to be achieved by 2030. It's the Sustainable Development Goals, but that was to get us sustainable. I really liked the framework that, I forget who mentioned it, that
Hank Rogers.
Yeah, he was such an optimist on this. And between 2030 and 2045, the 100-year anniversary of the UN, that it could be framed as the regenerative development goals. And I really thought I loved that. He nailed that, I thought.
That's a great idea.
Yep.
The thing is that we've got to get from now to then. But if you know that the path has got to leap instead of just amble over, do you leap radically or do you continue ambling knowing full well that you've got to take that leap at some point? So, yeah, we're going to get to 2030. Do we keep thinking about net zero being the targets? Because we kind of need to be a bit more radical than that.
Well, Google X talks a lot about moonshots. And one of the interesting things about moonshots is that they're a complete function of time relative to destination. And it's very important as soon as possible to change the trajectory of where we're trying to get to. And the later we wait to change the trajectory, actually, it gets exponentially harder. And so I kind of think you're onto something there because net zero is a good middling goal to get to. But as Tony just said, it's not going to solve the problem. In order to moonshot, we actually have to completely change our trajectory right now and look at where we need to get to, like not even where we need to get to, where we want to get to, and begin working for that. Because some of Google X's research shows that it takes about the same amount of effort to go on a linear curve as an exponential curve. So why not go on the exponential curve? Because it's going to take the same amount of work between now and 2030 or 2045 that it would take to go for a 10% or 15% improvement as it would take to go to like a radical 2,000% improvement.
We have this game in the UK called netball where you're allowed to, receive a ball, and once you receive it, you kind of pivot. And I think that this ball has been landed in our, it's landed in our hand, and now it's like, okay, if we need to pivot, now's the time.
Yeah, and I think that the global South, in particular Africa, have opportunities to leapfrog ahead of places like Western Europe and America because we're just in political gridlock and we have these frameworks that are archaic and infrastructure that's archaic. And I think, Nigeria, for example, Lagos is forecasted to triple in size by the end of the century. 2100, they'll go from 25 million people to, 75 million people. Those are the places where you're going to see leapfrogging happen because they need to rapidly prototype. They don't have a choice. And that's where humankind innovates, is when we're up against a wall. And we're up against a wall. And we're starting to see these climate events and civil unrest and all of these issues. Again, I think we need to get beyond country borders. And we need to become a global community that's rapidly prototyping these solutions. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot of the stuff happening in the global South. You're going to start seeing it happen in Africa. I think that's where some of the most exciting regenerative development is going to happen because they're not so stuck on the old systems.
It's amazing because even Cairo is already double the size of London.
Right.
And I don't think Cairo is getting the attention that it probably should be given the fact that it's as large as it is, and it's due to double in size too. So you're going to have these mega metropolises here. But I think, there is interesting work happening across the Middle East too. Like, I think the Saudis get a little bit criticized with NEOM and the line, but I do kind of admire the vision of trying to build something from scratch and create something. Masdar, has been criticized sometimes in the Emirates as an empty city because they've had to actually pivot some of what they were originally planning to do.
I started my PhD
to make it
Masdar.
work. But at the end of the day, these kind of mega projects do point. I'm a big believer that there have to be what I call alpha points in the collective for us to aim toward or to envision toward. Because without that, we really get bogged down. And we may all, as a group, fall short of the ultimate vision, but there have to be some guiding lights out there that are almost unobtainable for us to dream toward. And that's what I love what you're doing with Regenerative Cities, Tony, because you're reimagining these neighborhoods within cities in such a, quite honestly, optimistic way.
Well, it's inclusive. I'm not anti-new cities for rich people in the desert. And there are lighthouses and there are examples of technologies that are being implemented at NEOM and Masdar that I think are super relevant. But I think we tend to do things in the opposite way. We start to build buildings as these demonstrations of human ingenuity and impressive architecture, but we forget the human element to it. And the most sustainable thing to do is take the existing failing infrastructure and adaptively repurpose it. That is the most sustainable thing that we can do. And we know that the built environment will double in size or potentially triple in size. So it's not an either or, it's and. And the same thing with eco-village and suburban development. You need frameworks that also communicate with one another because it's an ecosystem and it needs to be bioregional because you're never going to produce coffee and bananas in New York City, no matter how good urban agriculture gets, no matter how advanced hydroponics are, you're just not going to do it, at least not in the, foreseeable future. So there needs to be bioregional food security, agricultural plans that work with small farmers, that work with permaculturalists, that work with different thinkers on food security, that is minimizing the supply chain as much as possible. And I think we all witnessed how crippling COVID was to the supply chain and how it increased inflation and how it's pushed so many more people into poverty and into starvation.
Yeah, I know. 20 years of progress on poverty reduction wiped out in 18 months.
I think one of the lovely points that you made, Stan, was this alpha point. And I think for me, it draws back to who can have the foresight, who's at a place where they're not worried about, taking their children to work and all of the more sort of Maslow's hierarchy of, lower needs, but getting to that point of actualizing, right? Oh, I'm at that point where I can actually really get inspired to think about what could be better. And I think if you're in the luxury of that space, and you can experiment. You've got these gaps between research where this is the lab, this is where it's being researched in Imperial College London or wherever. And then there's the gap between that and implementation. So you're implementing it. Now, when you've got the opportunity to implement it experimentally, you can go and take these experiments, putting them into the supply chain and be able to innovate ways of helping other communities somewhere, let's say in India, that their first ever lighting would be renewable.
Well, the other thing is that communication and the networks now actually make that possible.
Right.
Because it didn't used to be so easy to migrate an idea. And I think that's where we actually can see that radical exponential change. The pathway to the moonshot is going to be through networked collaboration. That's one of the things I love about the partnership with FOC. And, we were talking earlier about how I personally believe that the corporate model needs to and will give way to a network model. And we operate a network, and it does have functions as a company, but primarily we orient ourselves intellectually as a network and an ecosystem. And it's so fun to work with Tony because you do the same thing. And there's nothing more fun than having our network sync and harmonize with your network and then see what comes out of that. And these collaborations at COPS have done that. What we're going to do in Miami is going to do that. But it's really, I think, the only way we're going to do it. I see it like a network of gears, and whether a company knows it or not, they have to become a network. And they already are a network, but whether or not they're optimizing the network is anybody's guess. But the people who figure out that they're a network and then optimize the network soon learn that success doesn't come just from growing your network. That's a great outcome if you can do it. But real success comes from synchronizing your network with other networks so that you can form a bigger machine. And that's how you actually get to system change. That was my takeaway from Glasgow. Was I was never a system change guy. I always thought like, hey, we'll kind of innovate through tech our way out of it. But after last Glasgow, after COP, I realized that we actually really desperately need system change. But the system is too brittle and complex for revolution. Revolution was the answer of the 20th, even the 19th century. But the system is now way too connected and complex for revolution not to be like a degrading disaster. So we have to reinvent revolution. And I think that the way that we do that is by synchronizing these networks to get to system change as a machine. And that means you just got to go out and synchronize your network with other networks.
It reminds me of interoperability, right? You're designing interoperability into a system. There's a point at which rehabilitation of buildings won't be cost effective. So we'll keep on, renovating something to the point where it's actually better just to take it down now. And I think that's where, in the network analysis that you've got the opportunity of almost iterating on the best kind of solution for bringing negotiations between networks together so that at these touch points, whether it is experimental A, experimental B, that whatever the learnings are, they become this lateral flow rather than just this expansion for the means of expansion.
Well, yeah, growth for the sake of growth, right? Which we need to figure out how to become regenerative. Like one of the interesting things is growth doesn't necessarily mean outwardly expanding all the time. Like perennial growth is something that we need to be thinking about because we need to get to like a decoupled prosperity from GDP growth. Otherwise, we're on a road to nowhere.
Well, I think it all comes down to community. Community is resilience because if you have I grew up in an ashram, an intentional community, and we never went hungry. It didn't matter if we had money or not because someone always had something to share. And I think that's something that modern society has lost is that the resilience of community and the alchemy of these networks that are coming together is exponential alchemy that's happening. We've seen that by what's happening. That was my commitment in, Anne Rosenberg was our moderator of a regenerative placemaking panel yesterday, asked, what is your commitment coming out of COP? And it is a lot of effort and resources and time and money to come and produce these things. And it is no small feat, what you do and what we do, because this is not, we don't make money from this. I mean, I don't make money from, convening people, but we're making magic. We're creating alchemized energetic solutions for people. And I'm seeing it happening. I'm seeing the synapses firing. I'm seeing the conversations happening. And I think that's really kind of one of the roles that we play is as a convener.
Have you guys heard of fractal realities? So somebody was talking to me recently and made me feel so good about the work that we do by convening people. And they said, like, if you imagine that there are lots of independent timelines, so we're 4 people here together and 4 independent timelines, but we come together and we create this kind of fractal set of potential new realities that are in the timelines ahead of us. And so just by gathering people like this, you're actually creating this massive number of new potential realities just by convening people. And so it's not just about an event or just about a conversation or even just about a party. Like it's a great way to look at the way that you gather and connect people and the impact from that, because you're actually creating at the quantum level a whole new set of potential realities and pathways for people to flow down.
I think it expands liminal spaces. Right.
Can you define liminal?
Yeah, transitional spaces, point A to point B,
Yeah.
have spaces in between. Or as Debussy would call it, music is in between the notes. So it's that, you've got 2 people having a conversation, but that conversation has opened up a third space. So it's that interdependence of 2 factors, right? So you're not just yourself as an independent human. Tony's not himself as an independent human, but the moment that the union comes together of 2 independent beings, you get this Mandorla effect of the Vesica Pisces, the intersection between the 2. And it's that magic that then starts to expand. So you get these layerings, right? I'm going to draw it out. But it's like these layerings. So you get like, the more that you layer over, and then you start to see the Ikigai models coming through and all of these other layers of purpose and, affiliation and
that's why network collaboration is so important, because the network is exponential. We have 100,000 people in our network. You have 100,000 people in your network. But when you layer those networks together, you get incredible possibilities.
Because I come with my thought process, but then when we're talking about something maybe a little bit more towards a legacy system, I'm thinking about another person that perhaps these 2 conversations didn't afford. And now that another conversation has come in, so has 4 or 5 other people that I didn't bring into the 100,000 people space.
But Tony, isn't that kind of the power of cities? Isn't that why cities are powerful?
That's why
Because that's happening in cities. That's why cities exist.
People are, always, dogging cities, and especially during the pandemic. And I know London was a very unfriendly place during the pandemic, because it's small spaces, people are boxed up, the weather's cold, etc. Florida was the exact opposite. And that is why Florida was the recipient of the largest wealth transfer in human history. McKinsey fact. The other thing that people don't realize is 80% of GDP is produced in cities, but all the intellectual capital that comes out of cities, all of that hive mentality and the networking overlap that we're talking about, that happens in cities because they're hives of energy and innovation and commerce. And so if we can be inclusive and we can create resilient cities that are actually, buildings become, carbon sinks and energy producers instead of consumptive and extractive, then that changes the whole narrative. And I love Stefano Boeri's analogy of a building is like a tree. And if it could actually, because they're both fixed, they stay in places, one is regenerative and one is extractive, but we could actually change that narrative and a building could become like a tree. And it could have a root system that connects with other buildings and they could be intelligent.
Like a mycelial network.
Like a mycelial network that they're all communicating. And we have those technologies. The problem is that innovation and decarbonization is underinvested. The construction industry invests less than 1% in R&D and innovation. Tech is 15, 20%. So, we just need to redirect focus and resources. Basically, to decarbonize the world, we need to be investing $9 trillion a year in the right places. Currently, we're investing about $5 trillion, and that's up significantly from the last few years. So it's about resource allocation, and it is about changing the narrative around growth, right? You are decoupling regeneration from quarterly profits and capitalism. Capitalism, I'm also against everybody saying we need to throw capitalism out because free markets have accomplished a lot for society, for humans. And we're talking about saving ourselves, not the planet, right?
And there's also like long-term versus short-term fixes, because sometimes when you put a quote-unquote cap or solution to avoid the worst excesses of a market, you end up with longer, bigger problems down the road. So one example is Florida. There was a recent, because of Hurricane Ian, there's now like a very shaky reinsurance market for how they're going to insure property. But it turns out that the entire Florida real estate market is based on the ability to insure it so you can get a mortgage. And we're not reflecting the true cost of the risk from climate change in insurance premiums.
That's where externalities start.
And so, the state steps in to kind of underwrite that with a public market. But, we're at a point now where we've just invested billions and billions of dollars into building coastal real estate in Miami and around Florida. but it's not really certain that that was a good idea if it's about to get wiped out by a Category 5 hurricane in the next,
or
say,
sea
10
level
years.
rises.
Or sea level rise.
Tony, we were talking about just a minute ago, we were talking about cities and how there's this big hub of culture and ideas out of it. You made a great effort in putting Indigenous people in the panels yesterday, and they had some really solid things to say, I thought. One of the points that was made that cities were desertification, and I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
Human settlements since, as long as we're aware of it, dating back, pre-Pompeii, where we're just putting stones over nature and creating no space for trees or plants or other species, has been the way that we've developed. Is what we are commandeering and commanding nature and taking control of it and dominating it and not allowing space for other species. And I think that that's what people are referring to. Is actually, it's the concretification of the world. But people need to realize the facts. The built environment and cities only occupy 3% of the landmass of what's actually developable, not including oceans. And so, but they're responsible for 75% of CO2 emissions, 80% of GDP. So I think you need to look at, and we're only 53% of the world's populations. That shift is happening that we'll be at 70%, living in cities, another 3.5 billion people in the next 30 years, 27 years or so. And so there's an opportunity to really innovate in these cities, leveraging biophilic design, rewilding concepts, using biomaterials that actually breathe and act like nature, in balance with nature. And you could essentially create buildings that have a root system and a mycelium network that connected, communicated like a village, like a community of people that would able to be a support. You could trade power. I mean, all of this could be basically a reality of a future that is regenerative and responsive and resilient. And I'll give you one little example. The last Hurricane Ian that went through Southwest Florida, that was the costliest, one of the most expensive hurricanes in U.S. history. There was a community called Babcock Ranch, and it was on 60 Minutes. And it's this innovation district that is all solar powered. All of the utilities are undergrounded, and it had zero impact from the hurricane. Everything around it was decimated, essentially. And so even if you don't believe in climate change, which it's a waning group of people that I think are more on the extreme side of the equation, because there's just data to prove, otherwise, is showing that we need to be more resilient, even beyond the whole regeneration climate conversation. And it's the way that we build, how we build it, and are we doing it, and are we co-designing with those communities and what their needs are, and including indigenous. I mean, the indigenous steward 85% of our biodiversity, and they live in harmony with nature. That doesn't mean that I think everybody's going to move to the Amazon. I think that would be a disaster, frankly. But there's things we can learn from them, and we can incorporate into our modern urban planning schemes across the world. 7-generation planning, for example, 3 generations before, 3 generations ahead, thinking about what you're doing, not just for yourself in today in short terms, but thinking about the future and the past, and learning from the mistakes and applying those towards future vision that is regenerative and inclusive.
Indigenous wisdom is our most undervalued cultural asset. Agreed,
1,000%.
Stan, I'm curious, you work in currencies, and it's said that to achieve the goals, it'll cost $100 trillion. I'm curious what your thought is and what the future of currencies will look like to achieve that.
My favorite question. I have a lot of thoughts on that. So, we started the oldest digital currency in 2007 called VEN, which is backed partially by carbon as well as other assets. So it's like what people would now call a stable coin, but it's environmentally linked. Last year, we launched VEN Oxygen, which is VO2, and it pays nature for producing oxygen. And the supply side of it is limited only to guardians of trees and nature in a way. Both of these are issued by our AI. This week, we're going to be announcing a project in carbon for VEN Carbon, and we're going to be sharing some pretty exciting news about how that's going to be formulated using some of the new technologies that exist, like blockchains. But beyond that, I can see a wave coming. So there's a big wave coming, what I would call a $1 trillion wave, and then there's an even larger wave behind it. And the $1 trillion wave is the harmonization and tokenization of the global carbon markets. There's a foot race on right now, not only between companies, but between nations, to be the first or to be the place where the carbon markets go to live. Like, who's going to be the Wall Street of carbon is the $1 trillion question right now. Bermuda has come out strong, saying that they want to be the home of global carbon finance. And they have a leg up there because they're also the home of insurance and reinsurance. So there's a natural marriage there between risk and climate. Singapore is also doing it. Singapore is probably farther ahead in terms of infrastructure and markets because Bermuda doesn't have a market yet. Of course, there's the U.S. The California market is farthest ahead for carbon in the U.S. The Chinese have a China market. But above all that and around all that is going to be tokenization, and that's going to create a global market for carbon, which is going to be absolutely massive. And some level of, say, system intelligence will enable those things to interoperate and for us to find lower cost ways to introduce carbon assets into the global markets, whether they're blockchain enabled or not, but hopefully they'll be distributed and even decentralized. But behind that is a much bigger wave of what I would call, natural asset tokenization. And I just spoke about this at Bermuda Tech Week last week with some of the bigger players in the crypto space who are more observers, but the GBBC, the Global Blockchain Consortiums, Coin Center, even CoinDesk. And what we're all seeing is that behind carbon is going to be a granularization of asset pricing across a number of different biodiversity assets, and even beyond biodiversity, potentially into all the sustainable development goals. And that's going to be how we get to that $100 trillion capitalization for financing the goals. So imagine if there was tokenization around anti-poverty, or there's tokenization around the oceans, or there's tokenization around gender equality, and then ways for us to fund and create forwards for pre-funding or bonds to help finance these things. And then, if we do it right, we'll find a way for that economic value to go directly to the end point. The danger for us is shorting, that the markets will short these things out and cause a problem, or that the riches of all that will fall towards the old players. And that's the thing that we're working, I think, to try to prevent internally within Hub. We have a system called Ultra that allows for a wide variety of asset tokenization realities. But beyond that, I think there has to be some level of consensus that we will not let the Web 2 model of massive corporations controlling all the wealth become the reality for Web 3. Although I don't know if we're doing such a great job on that.
Some recent news to prove otherwise, right?
Well, the reality is
consolidation
that
happening.
Everyone talks about decentralization, but you got to look at what is the angle of decentralization? Bitcoin in particular, which everyone lauds as being decentralized, is really controlled by 7 mining companies.
Right.
I don't know.
Do you need to take off?
I need to check out.
Cool. Thanks so much,
Thanks
Stan.
so much.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Cool. How's this all landing for you? What's your mind working with right now?
For me, it was about replenish reserves. I always thought that I would create some kind of nature-backed coin and fund these communities of regenerative capabilities where you would bring in some amazing experiments into communities where help finance was required, and then support them with skills and research and capabilities, almost like this. We're thinking about this network system or overlapping network system, which I think is really beautiful, like the ashram, something always to share. I just think those spaces where, especially in India, where you've got this rural to urban migration, millions of people being displaced, I wonder if there's a way that we can redirect some of our efforts to keep people where they are and support them to live a better life.
Yeah, I think the promise of blockchain and decentralization and democratizing access to finance and opportunities is very noble and idealistic, and hasn't come to pass. And I'm a big supporter of kind of decentralized everything and really, giving people power back to the people. And we've been working on a white paper, which has devolved into a light paper because the tokenomics is extremely complex, and figuring out a way to roll out a tokenomics strategy within an underserved African-American community where people basically link blockchain, Web3 to crypto, which is, doesn't have a very good reputation right now and hasn't built a lot of trust. However, I think that we have to iterate and innovate and ideate these new technologies that do have the intention and opportunity to create more inclusion and equity within it. So our focus in our Phoenix Arts District project in Jacksonville is how can we leverage Web3 and blockchain to create equity within underserved communities. And initially, we're going to roll out with the whole fungible token where tenants were going to pay a percentage of their rent back into the treasury that was going to help fund initiatives like affordable housing and artist grants and other things. And realizing that there are regulatory, constraints that prevent you from doing things because then you could be perceived by the SEC as a security. The problem is that it's not understood enough of an industry, and it's, to have people that don't have even financial literacy to start talking about blockchain and Web3, I think is a bit of a stretch. And so I think it's all about simplifying what the goal is. And the goal is about participation. It's about decentralizing governance and decision-making and have them be in a participatory process where they feel part of a neighborhood. And that's what ends up happening is that there's a lot of gentrification because the community is not involved in the process of revitalizing an area. And I think that moving forward, I think that we will be able, with regulatory frameworks and social innovations and new finance models that can be decentralized, we can actually create equity and co-design the best outcomes. You can co-design the best outcomes for these underserved communities. And that's what we're focused on. So we are going to be launching a metaverse as well for this community hub where people will be able to, be like a marketplace. You can buy and trade, artworks and arts and crafts that are digital. And we were talking earlier about the needs to accomplish the SDGs. Well, the current global economy is $9 trillion a year. That in the next coming decades is going to grow to $90 trillion a year. And a lot of that is the digital economy that is evolving and exploding. And so again, there is a tremendous amount of abundance and wealth. It's just not properly distributed. And I think that we do have all the resources, again, to solve all these problems. But we need to open source, we need to share, and we need to make this future accessible to all. And I think that that's part of the challenge, because I've spent the last year going down the rabbit hole with a lot of advisors around the world on these solutions, and there's not really a consensus. And everybody, there's many different types of blockchains, and which ones are the most sustainable, and which ones are truly decentralized or not. And there's not really a consensus on it, particularly within the industry, and the industry experts. So I know, Tia, you have a bit of experience in this space, and I'm sure you have a very important perspective on it.
No, thank you for that. I was riffing on the fact that we want to have community involvement. We want to have a community that's engaged. But just because you've invited somebody doesn't mean that they want to. So how do you inspire them to be involved? I can give you money to lead a competition, and why don't we create this art piece? And hey, what is it that you desire the most to have in this communal space that we're going to have opened up? A couple of years ago, I would say maybe about 2017, I was walking around Venice Beach and talking to the chief innovation officer, who actually introduced me to the Hatch community. His name's Eric. And Eric had just identified about $16 billion worth of real estate areas and environments and open spaces where the community could actually get involved if there were some level of organization around that. And it always had me wondering, if you opened up these spaces for regenerative placemaking or experiments like urban agriculture or gardens like the Gangster Gardener, one of my favorite TED Talks. If a child grows a tomato, a child eats a tomato. And it's so simple, but it's inspirational. And I think we're at a point where technology can only do so much. You go to the 40th floor of a hermetically sealed building to ensure that it has a level of HVAC compliance, right? You want to make sure that the air is as clean as possible, as refreshing as possible. And at the same time, you just want to open the window. And let's say you're feeling anxious and you just want to have a connection with the outside. And you can't do that until you come out of this incredibly fenestrated building in order completely glazed oven of a space where you've got the, extractor fans of the HVAC pumping the hot air outdoors only for it to come through the front door again. So it's a really interesting time that we're living in. We've got the desertification, of course, with Masdar City. When I first started researching it, it was not that much built up than it is today. But this is, it's going back like 2009. And I was talking to Norman Foster's team about it because we'd worked on a Saudi project, the Saudi American bank, Samba Bank. And we'd just gone through the entire process of the headquarters building with Norman Foster. And interviewing them in London, I came across this massive poster and I just got really curious. Are you designing the master plan? And so the team at Norman Foster's, partnership put me in touch with whoever was master planning Masdar City. And I had this incredible opportunity to go from Masdar City to Aleppo to Beirut. And it was because at the time I was at Manchester University and my supervisor wanted me to compare gentrification, ancient cities, and a new city that had barely been lived in and wasn't even open for business. And it was such a transformative moment because on the one side, Solidaire, Mohammed Hariri himself was walking me around the city, showing me where the bomb blasts were and how the city had to evolve for the times. We had Adli Qudsi, now late Adli Qudsi, an incredible architect who was born in Syria and had transformed the city in 1984, making it a World Heritage Site. This ancient city has a tell that's 12th century. And whilst walking through the city, I will never forget him telling me, I wish we had more money to take out all of the archaeological finds. And we'd love to be able to take them out, but we just don't have the right kind of finance. Fast forward, when the bombs are going off in Aleppo, the first thing that I remembered is, aren't we happy that that's still underground? When the actual beautiful door that opens up to the old town was completely obliterated, my mind just went to that moment that Adli Qudsi had shared. And then you have this beautiful design of this going to achieve net zero. It was zero carbon, zero waste. We're going to achieve a lifestyle. And so I started my PhD just on this one interview with David Nelson at Norman Foster's partnership. And I really, Foster and Partners, and I really wanted to ask a very simple question. What makes a sustainable lifestyle in an urban environment like this? And so when you factor in life cycle analysis and you factor in whatever resources were required to bring into an environment that doesn't otherwise generate them, is it as resource efficient as you thought it was going to be? And for me, that was the birth of my research in net positive, because that net zero didn't really work because it was zero impact. And it was, I think, Richard Reynolds that was on site that I used to work with, sitting down, having these gahwas, talking about these really complex issues. When the first inhabitants of Masdar moved in, I did a panel post-occupancy evaluation of the city. And I remember these moments where I would sit down and talk to these students who were in the university saying, well, I can't change the air conditioner. It's actually too warm in my room. So I just opened the door. So I said, well, if you open the door, that stops the system. So then it condenses in your air conditioners and actually in your building. And then you start to see this, deterioration of the furnishings. Yeah, but I want to be in the outdoors. Although all of the research that had been done was to create a microclimate, to take it from 50 plus degrees felt temperature in the environment down to 35 degrees, which is amazing as an achievement of microclimate analysis, and being able to factor in this canopy and bringing in the shading and all of that coming from their own study of Aleppo's narrow streets with these beautiful stone walls and shading. It was that moment that made me realize that no matter what we do, unless if we have people inspired, that sustainable lifestyle doesn't really exist. That community engagement doesn't exist. That participation is a fantasy.
Yeah, it's artificial. You're building buildings for building's sake and should be monuments to human innovation, but you're not really focused on co-designing with the community. When you were talking about, the bombs going off in Syria and protecting all of those archaeological treasures, it reminded me of this series on World War II in London when everybody were in their bomb shelters, and the amount they did a study on happiness during different periods within England. And that was one of the times when there was the most happiness and the most sense of community, because people were forced to be together under a very stressful situation. And that's when people really united and galvanized. And again, it goes back to that sense of community, and community is resilient. And so even though, your very life is threatened on a day-to-day basis, and you're being bombed and everything is threatened, there's this sense of community and belonging. And I think that that's something that's really important. And I think architects and mayors and, planners and cities and states and governments need to realize that that is at the core of everything that we're doing, is building resilient and inclusive and diverse and sustainable communities. And that's how we're going to transcend most, if not all, of our problems. And so I think that is fundamental to, modern and new design, whether it's a new city or an old city or whatever you're doing. It's, is this a human-centric project? Are you building for humans? Are you building, to be a museum? Are you building, to be a display of human accomplishment? And I think that that's something that, we've seen so much as the past leading the design process. And I think it just needs to go back to a human-centric approach, place-based, human-centric, community-based, community-led, co-designed approach. And it's very difficult to work with communities. I'm not saying everybody fantasizes about, intentional communities as being, there's a gazillion of them in Costa Rica and all over the places in Bali. And, humans are complex, especially humans from different places with different cultures and different traditions. And, to live amongst each other is complex, and you have to have tolerance and acceptance and be able to work through differences. And I think that is something that is fundamental to how we co-design the cities of the future. And the indigenous do play a very important role. And so not only indigenous, but women, and particularly in Africa, where women are the leaders of their communities and their villages, empowering women is one of the SDGs, right? That's how we're going to solve a lot of the world's problems. So
I think the thorn here is this storyline of the common enemy, the war on ... the militarization of our humanity. The reason why I say this is because there's a cap to the amount that you can consciously develop as a human and as a community. I used to call it community actualization. And the reason I said that was because I used to run a community called Sandbox, and it was a digital community developed by a group of gentlemen. And my involvement with that was to get it to a point of safety after it had fallen apart in 2014. And it was that community actualization meant that every node, every member of that community had the opportunity to evolve, and then creating this canvas, an array of members who'd also had the opportunity to actualize. So what do you do when a community is actualized is very different from capping them. And I think, I've never really come back to that thinking, but I suppose if you want to get to conscious communities or conscious environments or conscious structures and systems, there is a level of, dare I say, spiritual evolution that we need to have to be able to connect with another without thinking that they're taking something away from me. It scares me when leaders talk about we need to fight, we need this war on climate, common
war
enemy.
On drugs.
Like everything is a war. No, it's not. How do you create peace in a warlike situation? And I love that we have examples of communities coming together and working together. And I feel that this anchoring into war is actually removing and stopping us from really identifying ways that we can flourish. Maybe we're at that precipice. I think we need to move away from our personal traumas played out through our activism. I think we need to go back and do our work. That's personal. And that's that inner journey. That's that journey between the head to the heart, potentially to the gut. A real deepening recognition that whatever we do in the world is a balance between that magic and logic, and the opportunity that we have to go deeper into ourselves and our relations and appreciate our place in the world, we've always asked these primordial questions: who are we, where do we come from, and why are we here? And I think that is much to do with the core values that we center and focus around in our lives. So we have a very unique opportunity to design these core values as a community, as a globe, as a humanity. And that's a beautiful opportunity. I think that then filters into everything that we do. Everything is created with that in mind. And that's confidence, creative confidence.
Stan, Tony, Tia, this is the Hatch Podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I loved it.
Who are we? What are we? What do we stand for? We've always been a people both encumbered and excited by these questions, these ineffable concepts of substance and worth. As we face the very real consequences of decades of taker mentality wrought by systems and structures intent on competition, growth for growth's sake, accumulation, and individual success at the expense of all else, we are faced with a beautiful opportunity to change. As Tony Cho bluntly points out, sustainability is status quo, and we know full well that that just isn't good enough. The window for achieving the SDGs, or merely avoiding existential annihilation, through standard sustainability models, closed some time ago. Regenerative technologies and ideologies for urban and rural development, food systems, and economics have opened the only window in the hermetically sealed skyscraper of our current predicament. But what does that look like? And how do we create a perennial model from devastation? Interestingly, the answers look a lot like a typical therapy session. Accept where we are, identify what no longer serves, and define the challenges we want to see. Then we begin to build. We replace systems that consume with solutions that produce. We develop resilience. We forego individual success for communal prosperity and cash in on the alchemy of community. We decentralize everything, eliminating borders and barriers to our shared vision of prosperity for every and all. We cultivate consciousness, and then we live. A shout out to our media and production team: Jessica Byerly, Allison Gregory, Kevin Hilton, Roy Chapman, Eli Kisko, Raymond Onsatagi, Sean Mackinson, Robert Edwards, and Mark Groner. A special thanks to Yarrow Craner, Jared Silverman, Pete Strom, Josie Caton, Eitan Shapira, Cassidy Seckman, Bryant Stersala, Rachel Hicks, Katie Yam, and Lou Morris. With so much gratitude to the Hatch supporters, Steelcase, the Kauffman Foundation, the Gwydion Fund, Envision Equality, the Hatch volunteers, board of directors, Hatch Guardians, and the community who help make this work and mission possible. To learn more about Hatch, visit hatchexperience.org. Building community could not happen without food. And with that, I'd like to thank Whistle Pig Korean, Red Tractor Pizza, and Zocalo Coffee House. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Shoot me an email at tate@iaminterchange.org. That's tate@iaminterchange.org. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.